Chapter 16 New Year's Eve at the Light. The Green Gables folk went home after Christmas, Rilla under solemn covenant to return for a month in the spring. More snow came before New Year's, and the harbor froze over, but the gulf still was free beyond the white imprisoned fields. The last day of the old year was one of those bright, cold, dazzling winter days which bombard us with their brilliancy and command our admiration but never our love. The sky was sharp and blue, the snow diamonds sparkled insistently, the stark trees were bare and shameless with a kind of brazen beauty, the hills shot assaulting lances of crystal. Even the shadows were sharp and stiff and clear-cut, as no proper shadow should be. Everything that was handsome seemed 10 times handsomer, and less attractive in the glaring splendor, and everything that was ugly seemed 10 times uglier. And everything was either handsome or ugly. There was no soft blend or kind obscurity or elusive mistiness in that searching glitter. The only things that held their own of individuality were the firs, for the fir is the tree of mystery and shadows and yields never to the encroachments of crude radiance. But finally the day began to realize that she was growing old. Then a certain pensiveness fell over her beauty, which dimmed yet intensified it. Sharp angles, glittering points melted away into curves and enticing gleams. The white harbor put on soft grays and pinks. The faraway hills turned amethyst. "The old year is going away beautifully," said Anne. She and Leslie and Gilbert were on their way to the Four Winds Point, having plotted with Captain Jim to watch the new year at an inn at the Light. The sun had set, and in the southwestern sky hung Venus, glorious and golden, having drawn as near to her earth sister as is possible for her. For the first time, Anne and Gilbert saw the shadow cast by that brilliant star of evening, that faint, mysterious shadow, never seen save when there was white snow to reveal it, and then only with averted vision, vanishing when you gaze at it directly. "It's like the spirit of a shadow, isn't it?" whispered Anne. "You can see it so plainly haunting your side when you look ahead, but when you turn and look at it, it's gone. I've heard that you can see the shadow of Venus only once in a lifetime, and that within a year of seeing it, your life's most wonderful gift will come to you," said Leslie. But she spoke rather hardly. Perhaps she thought that even the shadow of Venus could bring her no gift of life. Anne smiled in the soft twilight. She felt quite sure what the mystic shadow promised her. They found Marshall Elliott at the lighthouse. At first, Anne felt inclined to resent the intrusion of this long-haired, long-bearded eccentric into the familiar little circle, but Marshall Elliott soon proved his legitimate claim to the membership in the household of Joseph. He was a witty, intelligent, well-read man, rivaling Captain Jim himself in the knack of telling a good story. They were all glad when he agreed to watch the old year out with them. Captain Jim's small nephew Joe had come down to spend New Year's with his great uncle and had fallen asleep on the sofa with the first mate, curled up in a huge golden ball at his feet. "Ain't he a dear little man?" said Captain Jim gloatingly. "I do love to watch a little child asleep. Mistress Blythe, it's the most beautiful sight in the world. Joe does love to get down here for a night because I have him sleep with me. At home he has to sleep with the other 2 boys, and he doesn't like it. 'Why can't I sleep with father, Uncle Jim?' says he. 'Everybody in the Bible sleep with their fathers.' As for the question he asks, the minister himself couldn't answer them. They fair swamp me. 'Uncle Jim, if I wasn't me, who'd I be? And Uncle Jim, what would happen if God died?' He fired them 2 off at me tonight afore he went to sleep. As for his imagination, it sails away from everything. It makes up the most remarkable yarns, and then his mother shuts him up in the closet for telling stories. And he sits down and makes up another one, and has it ready to relate to her when she lets him out. He had one for me when he came down tonight. 'Uncle Jim,' says he, solemn as a tombstone, 'I had a venture in the glen today.' 'Yes, what was it?' says I, expecting something quite startling, but nowise prepared for what I really got. 'I met a wolf in the street,' says he, 'an enormous wolf, with a big red mouth and awful long teeth.' 'Uncle Jim, I didn't know there was any wolves up the glen,' says I. 'Oh, he comes there from far, far away,' says Joe, 'and I thought he was going to eat me up, Uncle Jim.' 'Were you scared?' says I. 'No, 'cause I had a big gun,' says Joe, 'and I shot the wolf dead. Uncle Jim's solid dead, and then he went up to heaven and bit God,' says he. Well, I was fair staggered, Mistress Blythe. The hours bloomed into mirth around the driftwood fire. Captain Jim told stories, and Marshall Elliott sang old Scotch ballads in a fine tenor voice. Finally, Captain Jim took down his old brown fiddle from the wall and began to play. He had a tolerable knack of fiddling, which all appreciated save the first mate, who sprang from the sofa as if he had been shot, emitted a shriek of protest, and fled wildly up the stairs. "Can't cultivate an ear for music in that cat nohow," said Captain Jim. "He won't stay long enough to learn to like it. When we got the organ up at the Glen Church, old Elder Richards bounced up from his seat the minute the organist began to play and scuttled down the aisle and out of the church at the rate of a no man's business. It reminded me so strong of the first mate tearing loose as soon as I began to fiddle that I come nearer to laughing out loud in church than I ever did before or since." There was something so infectious in the rollicking tunes which Captain Jim played that very soon Marshall Elliott's feet began to twitch. He had been a noted dancer in his youth. Presently he started up and held out his hands to Leslie. Instantly she responded. Round and round the firelit room they circled with a rhythmic grace that was wonderful. Leslie danced like one inspired. The wild, sweet abandon of her music seemed to have entered into and possessed her. Anne watched her in fascinated admiration. She had never seen her like this. All the innate richness and color and charm of her nature seemed to have broken loose and overflowed in crimson cheek and glowing eye and grace of motion. Even the aspect of Marshall Elliott with his long beard and hair could not spoil the picture. On the contrary, it seemed to enhance it. Marshall Elliott looked like a Viking of elder days, dancing with one of the blue-eyed, golden-haired daughters of the Northland. "The prettiest dancing I ever saw, and I've seen some in my time," declared Captain Jim, when at last the bow fell from his tired hand. Leslie dropped into her chair, laughing, breathless. "I love dancing," she said apart to Anne. "I haven't danced since I was 16, but I love it. The music seems to run through my veins like quicksilver, and I forget everything, except the delight of keeping time to it. There isn't any floor beneath me or roof over me. I'm floating amid the stars." Captain Jim hung his fiddle up in its place beside a large frame enclosing several banknotes. "Is there anybody else of your acquaintance who can afford to hang his walls with banknotes for pictures?" he asked. "There's 20 $10 there, not worth a glass over them. They're old Bank of P.E. Island notes. Had them by me when the bank failed, and I had 'em framed and hung up, partly as a reminder not to put your trust in banks, and partly to give me a real luxurious millinery feeling. Hullo, matey, don't be scared. You can come back now. The music and revelry is over for tonight. The old year has just another hour to stay with us. I've seen 76 New Years come in out over that gulf yonder, Mistress Blythe." "You'll see 100, said Marshall Elliott. Captain Jim shook his head. "No, and I don't want to, at least. I think I don't. Death grows friendlier as we grow older. Not that one of us really wants to die, though, Marshall. Tennyson spoke truth when he said that. There's old Mrs. Wallace up at the Glen. She's had heaps of trouble all her life, poor soul, and she's lost almost everyone she cared about. She's always saying that she'll be glad when her time comes, and she doesn't want us to journey any longer in this vale of tears. But when she takes a sick spell, there's a fuss. Doctors from town and a trained nurse and enough medicine to kill a dog. Life may be a vale of tears, all right, but there are some folks who enjoy weeping, I reckon." They spent the old year's last hour quietly around the fire. A few minutes before 12, Captain Jim rose and opened the door. "We must let the new year in," he said. Outside was a fine blue night. A sparkling ribbon of moonlight garlanded the gulf. Inside the bar, the harbor shone like a pavement of pearl. They stood before the door and waited. Captain Jim with his ripe, full experience, Marshall Elliott in his vigorous but empty middle life, Gilbert and Anne with their precious memories of exquisite hopes, Leslie with her record of starved years and her hopeless future. The clock on the little shelf above the fireplace struck 12. "Welcome, New Year," said Captain Jim, bowing low as the last stroke died away. "I wish you all the best year of your lives, mates. I reckon that whatever the new year brings us will be the best of the great captain has for us, and somehow or other we'll all make port in a good harbor." Chapter 17. A Four Winds Winter. Winter set in vigorously after New Year's. Big white drifts heaped themselves about the little house, and palms of frost covered its windows. The harbor ice grew harder and thicker until the Four Winds people began their usual winter traveling over it. The safe ways were bushed by a benevolent government, and night and day the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells sounded on it. On moonlit nights, Anne heard them in her house of dreams like fairy chimes. The gulf froze over, and the Four Winds light flashed no more. During the months when navigation was closed, Captain Jim's office was his sinecure. "The first mate and I will have nothing to do till spring except keep warm and amuse ourselves," The last lighthouse keeper used always to move up to the glen in winter, but I'd rather stay at the point. The first mate might get poisoned or chewed up by dogs at the glen. It's a mite lonely, to be sure, with neither the light nor the water for company. But if our friends come to see us often, we'll weather it through. Captain Jim had an ice boat, and many a wild, glorious spin Gilbert and Anne and Leslie had over the glib harbor ice with him. Anne and Leslie took long snowshoe tramps together, too, over the fields or across the harbor after storms, or through the woods beyond the glen. They were very good comrades in their rambles and their fireside communings. Each had something to give the other. Each felt life the richer for friendly exchange of thought and friendly silence. Each looked across the white fields between their homes with a pleasant consciousness of a friend beyond. But in spite of all this, Anne felt that there was always a barrier between Leslie and herself, a constraint that never wholly vanished. "I don't know why I can't get closer to her," Anne said one evening to Captain Jim. "I like her so much. I admire her so much. I want to take her right into my heart and creep right into hers, but I can never cross the barrier." "You've been too happy all your life, Mistress Blythe," said Captain thoughtfully. "I reckon that's why you and Leslie can't get real close together in your souls. The barrier between you is her experience of sorrow and trouble. She ain't responsible for it, and you ain't, but it's there, and neither of you can cross it." "My childhood was very happy before I came to Green Gables," said Anne, gazing soberly out of the window at the still, sad, dead beauty of the leafless tree shadows on the moonlit snow. "Maybe not, but it was just the usual unhappiness of a child who hasn't anyone to look after it properly. There hasn't been any tragedy in your life, Mistress Blythe, and poor Leslie's been almost all tragedy. She feels, I reckon, though maybe she hardly knows she feels it, that there's a vast deal in her life you can't enter nor understand, and so she has to keep you back from it, hold you off, so to speak, from hurting her. You know, if we've got anything about us that hurts, we shrink from anyone's touch on or near it. It holds good with our souls, as well as our bodies, I reckon. Leslie's soul must be near raw. It's no wonder she hides it away." "If that were really all, I wouldn't mind, Captain Jim. I would understand. But there are times, not always, but now and again, when I almost have to believe that Leslie doesn't seem to like me. Sometimes I surprise a look in her eyes that seems to show resentment and dislike. It goes so quickly, but I've seen it. I'm sure of that. And it hurts me, Captain Jim. I'm not used to being disliked, and I've tried so hard to win Leslie's friendship." "You have won it, Mistress Blythe. Don't you go cherishing any fool notion that Leslie don't like you. If she didn't, she wouldn't have anything to do with you, much less chumming with you as she does. I know Leslie Moore too well not to be sure of that." "The first time I ever saw her driving her geese down the hill on the day I came to Four Winds, she looked at me with the same expression," persisted Anne. "I felt it. Even in the midst of my admiration of her beauty, she looked at me resentfully. She did indeed, Captain Jim." "The resentment must have been about something else, Mistress Blythe, and you just came in for a share of it, because you happened past. Leslie does take sudden sullen spells now and again, poor girl. Can't blame her when I know what she has to put up with. I don't know why it's permitted. The doctor and I have talked a lot about the origin of evil, but we haven't quite found out all about it yet. There's a vast of understandable things in life, ain't there, Mistress Blythe? Sometimes things seem to work out real proper-like, same as with you and the doctor, and then again they all seem to go catawampus. There's Leslie, so clever and beautiful, you'd think she was meant for a queen, and instead she's cooped up over there, robbed of almost everything a woman to value, with no prospect except waiting on Dick Moore all her life. Though, mind you, Mistress Blythe, I dare say she'd choose her life now such as it is, rather than the life she'd lived with Dick before he went away. That's something a clumsy old sailor's tongue mustn't meddle with. But you've helped Leslie a lot. She's a different creature since you come to Four Winds. Us old friends see the difference in her as you can't. Miss Cornelia and me was talking it over the other day, and it's one of the mighty few pints that we see eye to eye on. So just you throw overboard any idea of her not liking you." Anne could hardly discard it completely, for there were undoubtedly times when she felt with an instinct that was not to be combated by reason that Leslie harbored a queer, indefinable resentment towards her. At times, this secret consciousness marred the delight of their comradeship. At others, it was almost forgotten. But Anne always felt the hidden thorn was there, and might prick her at any moment. She felt a cruel sting from it on the day when she told Leslie of what she hoped the spring would bring to the little house of dreams. Leslie looked at her with hard, bitter, unfriendly eyes. "So you are to have that, too," she said in a choked voice, and without another word she had turned and gone across the fields homeward. Anne was deeply hurt, For the moment, she felt as if she could never like Leslie again. But when Leslie came over a few evenings later, she was so pleasant, so friendly, so frank and witty and winsome that Anne was charmed into forgiveness and forgetfulness. Only she never mentioned her darling hope to Leslie again, nor did Leslie ever refer to it. But one evening, when late winter was listening for the word of spring, she came over to the little house for a twilight chat, and when she went away, she left a small white box on the table. Anne found it after she was gone and opened it wonderingly. In it was a tiny white dress of exquisite workmanship, delicate embroidery, wonderful tucking, sheer loveliness. Every stitch in it was handwork, and the little frills of lace at the neck and sleeves were of real Valenciennes. Lying on it was a card, with Leslie's love. What hours of work she must have put into it, said Anne, and the material must have cost more than she could really afford. It is very sweet of her. But Leslie was brusque and curt when Anne thanked her, and again the latter felt thrown back upon herself. Leslie's gift was not alone in the little house. Miss Cornelia had, for the time being, given up sewing for unwanted, unwelcome 8th babies and fallen to sewing for a very much wanted first one, whose welcome would leave nothing to be desired. Philippa Blake and Diana Wright each sent a marvelous garment, and Mrs. Rachel Lynde sent several, in which good material and honest stitches took the place of embroidery and frills. Anne herself made many, desecrated by no touch of machinery, spending over them the happiest hours of that happy winter. Captain Jim was the most frequent guest of the little house, and none was more welcome. Every day, Anne loved the simple-souled, true-hearted old sailor more and more. He was as refreshing as a sea breeze, as interesting as some ancient chronicle. She was never tired of listening to his stories, and his quaint remarks and comments were a continual delight to her. Captain Jim was one of those rare and interesting people who never speak, but they say something. The milk of human kindness and the wisdom of the serpent were mingled in his composition in delightful proportions. Nothing ever seemed to put Captain Jim out or depress him in any way. "I've kind of contracted a habit of enjoying things," he remarked once, when Anne had commented on his invariable cheerfulness. "It's got so chronic that I believe I even enjoy the disagreeable things. It's great fun thinking they can't last. Old rheumatiz, says I, when it grips me hard, you've got to stop aching sometime. The worse you are, the sooner you'll stop, maybe. I'm bound to get better of you in the long run, whether in the body or out of body." One night, by the fireside at the light, Anne saw Captain Jim's life book. He needed no coaxing to show it, and proudly gave it to her to read. "I read it to leave to little Joe," he said. "I don't like the idea of everything I've done and seen being cleaned forgot after I've shipped for my last voyage. Joe, he'll remember it, and tell the yarns to his children." It was an old leather-bound book filled with the record of his voyages and adventures. Anne thought what a treasure trove it would be to a writer. Every sentence was a nugget. In itself, the book had no literary merit. Captain Jim's charm of storytelling failed him when he came to pen and ink. He could only jot down the outline of his famous tales, and both spelling and grammar were sadly askew. But Anne felt that if anyone possessed of the gift could take that simple record of a brave, adventurous life, reading between the bald lines the tales of danger staunchly faced and duty manfully done, a wonderful story might be made from it. Rich comedy and thrilling tragedy were both lying hidden in Captain Jim's life book, waiting for the touch of the master hand to waken the laughter and grief and horror of thousands. Anne said something of this to Gilbert as they walked home. "Why don't you try your hand at it yourself, Anne?" Anne shook her head. "Oh, no, I only wish I could, but it's not in the power of my gift. You know what my forte is, Gilbert, the fanciful, the fairy-like, the pretty. To write Captain Jim's life book as it should be written, one should be a master of vigorous yet subtle style, a keen psychologist, a born humorist, and a born tragedian. A rare combination of gifts is needed. Paul might do, if he were older. Anyhow, I'm going to ask him to come down next summer and meet Captain Jim." "Come to this shore," wrote Anne to Paul. "I'm afraid you cannot find here Nora or the Golden Lady or the Twin Sailors, but you'll find one old sailor who can tell you wonderful stories." Paul, however, wrote back, saying regretfully that he could not come that year. He was going abroad for 2 years' study. "When I return, I'll come to Four Winds, dear teacher," he wrote. "But meanwhile, Captain Jim is growing old," said Anne sorrowfully, "and there's nobody to write his life book."